Now more than ever, innovative technologies are fueling change and sparking new ways of thinking. Collaboration between corporations and startups is key to staying at the forefront of these trends. However, finding the right startups can be expensive, time-consuming, and ineffective. But Plug and Play is here to help. As a corporate partner, you will gain access to a whole ecosystem of innovation. Discover startups that meet your tech interests. Stay updated on the latest trends and network with industry peers. We will help you during every stage of your innovation journey, no matter where you are and where you want to go. Get in touch today.
Thank you, everybody, for attending, and happy Monday. Hope you guys had a great weekend. We're excited to kick off the week with this panel, Business International Expansion. And so with Plug and Play being a global company, it would only make sense that half of our startups in our accelerator programs are US based, with the other half usually being international, spread out anywhere from Australia to China, down to Brazil, up to Finland or Iceland, and so on. So when providing mentorship for these accelerator programs, one question that really comes up quite a bit is, how do we expand internationally? And so since the door swings both ways, we wanted to provide insight from both perspectives. And so we're grateful that we have Roger Royse here, who is the managing partner at Haynes & Boone, who's going to discuss the logistics of international companies expanding into the US. And then Stephen Wares, who's the vice president of business development at CCW Business Solutions, Inc., who will discuss US companies expanding out. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to either Stephen or Roger, whoever would like to get started first. And during the presentation, if I could have you all just shut off your cameras and mute yourself, that would be great. Thank you.
All right, thanks very much. Steve, if you don't mind, I'll just get started.
Absolutely, Roger, go for it.
So I'm Roger Royse. I'm a corporate and tax partner in Palo Alto with the law firm of Haynes & Boone. We're an AmLaw 100 firm with offices in the US and outside the US. I work with startups, almost all tech startups, and about half of them are from other countries coming inbound. And this is a little bit of a misnomer in the title. We should call this How Startups Can Move to the US, including Fargo, or expand internationally. I'm going to cover the inbound side for companies coming into the US. Steve's going to talk about the outbound side for companies going out. And we've got about an hour, including Q&A. Use the Q&A box if you have questions. Chat me if there's something I need to know right away. So this is me. As I said, I'm a lawyer, and I form companies. I do financings, M&A, commercial contracts, and mostly I work with tech, almost all tech companies. Most of them tend to be agriculture technology companies, but also a variety of other, health tech is big, energy tech is big. There's, believe it or not, a lot of overlap between all three of those sectors and some of the tech that's being applied. And of course, fintech, enterprise, all the rest. Steve, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. My name's Stephen Wares. I'm with CCW. I've spent the last 22 years helping US-based technology companies in all shapes and sizes expand from the US into multiple countries around the world. Typically, our clients are Series B, C, D stage companies, but they could also be, small public companies who are looking to consolidate their small disparate headcounts around the world under sort of, if you like, one vendor for international support services. A couple of company names that you might be familiar with that we've worked with in recent times. Slack is probably one that everyone's familiar with. Another company called Okta, Hotel Tonight. So, traditional tech companies covering med tech, tech in all its shapes and sizes, some ag tech as well. So I'll cover the US outbound component with Roger looking in the other direction.
Okay, I won't spend a lot of time being Silicon Valley focused because I know that's not what this is about, but I will do my one pitch. and tell you that, and by the way, I used to practice and live in Fargo, and now I'm out here in California. And my theory is that everybody eventually ends up in California. In fact, when I came here 30 years ago, I said, God, the weather's so nice. Why doesn't everybody in the world move here? And I realized that everybody had. That's the one downside. But there's a reason for that. There's probably $7 trillion of market cap in this valley right now in terms of public companies. The venture capital industry, well, you can tell this slide's 6 months old. It's now about 130 billion, not $100 billion industry. And of course, a lot of top tech talent. So you're going to find companies from all over the world moving into California, into the Silicon Valley, and into the US. So let me jump ahead and tell you what I hope we get to be able to cover here in the next hour. On the legal side, and I am a lawyer, so these are the issues that I typically concern myself with. Just the corporate structure, getting the right sort of legal structure in place. Tax just looms large in the United States over everything, and it's probably more complicated than you think on the inbound side. The good news is we can almost always find a tax-free way for a non-US company to migrate into the US. If there are US owners of that non-US company, it might get a little tricky, but we will get there. Liability protection, you will find that the US has, and I'll talk more about this in a minute, has maybe a different set of policy concerns than other countries when it comes to legal liability. So in some places, you will find that this can be a very risky place to do business. And that's why we always want to have a legal entity that acts as a shield of any US liabilities, as a shield between the US liability, both tax and general liability, and the foreign parent. So if something does go really wrong here in the US, that liability stops at the water's edge, at the border. Privacy is looming large here in the US. And again, oddly enough, there's privacy laws all over the world. In fact, China has just last week enacted their own privacy law, very similar to GDPR. Here in the US, it's much different, much different. There is not a national privacy law, except for a couple of industries, healthcare and financial information. There is, however, state privacy laws, depending on which of the 50 states you're in. And California is by far the toughest. And it's different. That's the other thing. The concerns, the way the structure is set up, it might be a little counterintuitive. I'll talk more about that later, but just be aware that that's a big issue these days. Regulatory, we'll talk more about that in a minute. Again, you're going to find sort of a different set of policy considerations from other countries. And then, of course, intellectual property protection, patent, trademarks, copyrights, trade secret, that's all local. It's all geographically based. So wherever you do business, you really have to be familiar with and comply with the laws of that jurisdiction to protect your IP. And then finally, employment. Again, you're going to find some sort of countervailing considerations here in the US, depending what state you're in, between freedom of contract on the one hand, allowing people to make whatever deal they want to make, but then employee protection on the other hand. And so we have a maze of rules to negotiate through. And then, of course, there's a million non-legal considerations. And Steve will talk a little bit more about that, I think. So before we jump into that, let me just kind of take a step back and say that on the structuring side, so you're a non-US business, and the way it usually works in my practice is there'll be a company from another country that has proven their concept in their home country. They've launched, they've got customers, they've got revenue, they've got product market fit. They're doing well enough in their country that they want to expand into the US. Maybe they want that huge market that's here. Maybe they're coming here looking for finance, for money, for venture capitalists. Remember that $130 billion slide? Or maybe they need to recruit talent, whatever it is. They've decided it's time to come into the US. And I will tell you, I've worked with companies that come into the US on a hope and a shoestring, hope and a prayer, wing and a prayer, we used to say back in Fargo. And I've seen companies that have billions of dollars of market cap in their home country that just decide to enter the US. That only happens with China companies, by the way. That's where you can find that sort of thing. But they all have the same issue. You are a startup once you get here. You might have $1 billion of market cap in China, but you're still a startup here because you're starting from scratch in the US. And we have to go through my whole checklist, which, by the way, I have in writing if anybody wants a copy. It's legal and non-legal. It's a legal and non-legal checklist for coming in. Just email me and I'll provide that. But first question, do we form a new entity? Or do we just rent some space in Palo Alto and put up a sign and start doing business? If you do just put up a shingle or a sign and start doing business, you effectively have a branch in the US. And that means that your non-US entity is going to be subject to all of the laws of this country, even though it's a non-US entity, because you're doing business here. You're going to have to file a tax return, you're going to have to pay taxes, you're going to be subject to liability for anything that happens, all the employment rules, etc. So it's not a very advantageous way for a non-US entity to do business here, both for tax and liability. Number one, most of the non-US entities I work with, they don't want to file US tax returns. They don't really, and they especially if you're unlucky enough to be in California, they especially don't want to have to file California returns, because California is particularly nosy about what foreign companies are doing here. So instead, what we'll do is form a US corporation. That's the US subsidiary. Foreign company will own 100% of that US corporation, which will then do business here. And that US company will get into the system, file returns, do all of the compliance. And of course, the first question people ask is, gee, where should we incorporate that company? I hear a lot about Delaware, but what if I'm doing business in California? Should it be California? And what's the stuff about Nevada? You know, I hear about Nevada companies. Well, I can tell you that my rule of thumb is, if you're doing business in more than one state, you should be a Delaware corporation, because it's just easy and it's internationally recognized. You can take investment into that company. You can move from state to state fairly easily. If you're only doing business in a state like Nevada or California, then you may as well incorporate under the laws of that state. But just don't plan on ever moving that company. Let me put it this way: you would have to merge it out into another state, into another organization if you wanted to move out. California makes it hard to leave. It's a little bit of a lobster trap, right? Easy to get into, hard to get out of. So just keep that in mind. So most of the time I form Delaware corporations as subsidiaries, because most of my non-US clients that come into this state, they want to dominate the whole country. They don't want just one state. Nevada, hardly ever anymore. And I'm licensed in Nevada. I did that because about 10 years ago, because I thought every company in the world would want to incorporate in Nevada because they had such an easy corporate law. So I took the bar exam and I got licensed there, and then they immediately changed the law to make it really difficult. Now you have to have a business license there. So, oh well. All right, which one's right for you? If you're a non-US corporation, it is almost always going to be what we call a C corporation. That's a corporation that's taxed as a separate entity, right? These other entities are all what we call pass-throughs, but that almost never works for a non-US company coming into the US. The few times that it does work is sometimes with companies from India coming into the US, because of the weird transfer pricing rules that we have in India. I have on a couple of occasions, it turned out to make more sense to operate through a pass-through or a branch, a pass-through typically. And a pass-through just means that the foreign company is being taxed on the income of the US operation. And the other time is if we have an individual owner and you're investing in some asset that's going to generate a gain, usually a passive capital gain, like real estate down the road, then sometimes it makes sense. But if you're a typical operating company coming into the US, 99.9% of the time, you're a Delaware C corporation. Let's see here. I think that's you, Steve.
Yes, it is. Thanks very much, Roger. So everything Roger's just told you about coming and setting up in the US, US businesses also need to be considering when they are expanding outside of the US. It's actually very interesting to hear Roger's presentation because of the similarities in considerations that work in both directions. So typically, one of the first things we see companies looking at is we're at a stage of our business and we're looking to expand into a foreign market, either because we have been selling remotely from the US into these foreign markets for many years, and we believe that there's now an opportunity for us to really ramp things up. Perhaps there's a shortage of talent in our particular industry or expensive talent in our industry here in the United States, and we're looking to reduce the cost of that talent or just simply hire more of it. And so it's a sort of either a revenue growth with sales that over the last 22 years, we've traditionally seen sort of sales growth come from selling into the European Union, not exclusively, but that's been the mainstay. And cost reduction being perhaps looking for, highly talented, but less expensive than Silicon Valley technicians, engineers, developers, etc. in whether it's Eastern Europe, India, China, Southeast Asia, wherever that might be. Or perhaps the company is at a stage in the United States where they're thinking, well, look, we're getting close to using up our net operating losses, and we're looking to reduce our overall worldwide corporate tax liability. Therefore, the purpose of expanding overseas is to perhaps gain a foothold in a lower tax jurisdiction. I'll pick a couple of countries, one that might be more traditional, like Ireland, and one that one might describe as exotic, maybe Liechtenstein. And so what would be your way to expand internationally as part of an overall tax reduction strategy? So a number of reasons why, but I've traditionally seen over the last 22 years that the main reason is growth. You're working with growth stage companies. They're looking to get to IPO. And so growth is what it's all about, new customer acquisition and pushing forward. And so there's also a need for speed. We want to get it done. We want to get it done now. And of course, things in the US, I would say, work pretty fast, but it's by no means the fastest country from a bureaucratic standpoint in the world. There are many faster and of course, many slower. So I think it's worth being aware that when you do push to expand internationally, you need a little bit of patience because things can take time. And just to illustrate some of the sort of timing issues, if you decide, and we're going to have a look on the next slide at some of those same considerations for structuring as Roger just outlined for the United States, if you decide that you're going to hire and set up a subsidiary in a foreign country, if you were to, for example, go into the UK or Ireland, you can set up your foreign sub in a matter of days. In fact, in the UK, you could even pay a very small premium and have your entity incorporated in a day. If you go into Germany, it's probably fair to allow 4 to 6 weeks. Most of that time is because you need an appointment with a notary, and the notary's got to have to go through all your documentation, and that can just take some time. If you're perhaps going into Brazil, Claudia, I'm aware you're dialing in from Brazil, so I certainly don't want to misstate anything here, but it can take a few months to get up and running in Brazil. India can certainly be the same. We see sort of 2 to 3 months as the timeline for setting up in India and Brazil. And China can be sort of 3 months getting through the very strict process of going through all the various agencies and ministries to get the approvals and the sign-offs. And then it can take a further 3 months to get your business license. So you may need to allow up to 6 months in some countries to actually get to a point where you're able to trade. So just be aware of that when you're planning your international expansion, that your target country might require a lot of time to get up and running. I see Claudia saying that now to open a company, it's getting better, but taxes are certainly a challenge. That is certainly true. And equally, depending on what you're going to be doing in the country, there could be the requirement for, regulatory approval for perhaps med tech or pharma. We've certainly seen this with a number of our clients, perhaps going to Europe to get their CE mark and gather data so they can bring that back to get FDA approvals, etc. But they may face some hurdles upfront getting the necessary permits or approvals to actually be able to carry out their trials in country. And again, depending on what you're bringing into certain countries around the world, there may be restrictions on what you can and can't import. So all of those things can take time and slow you down. But I think beyond that, and Roger, if you can pop to that next slide there, thank you. We obviously do need to consider, what is the best type of registration for your circumstances. And of course, if you are doing business with a country, in other words, you're selling internationally, you're doing business with a variety of countries around the world, but you're not about to hire anyone or set up an office or really do anything in the country, I think it's fair to say that you can probably continue to do nothing at all. As long as you've got your imports taken care of, you've got any VAT issues on import from the US, you can usually handle those without a need for any sort of in-country registration. But I think when you cross the line of doing business with a country to doing business in a country, that's really where you need to be considering these selection of options. So what would be doing business in a country? Well, you might hire an employee. You might put a name on an office. You might lease an office through Regis. You might start to provide some after-sales support by flying people into the country to carry out some training or some technical service support, et cetera, et cetera. So I think what foreign tax jurisdictions are looking to understand is, have you now created nexus, to use the American term, or what certainly in Europe we would call, and I believe globally there's more of a use of the terminology permanent establishment. So something that might suggest a degree of permanency. And with it, the local tax authorities would say, well, we're going to seek to tax the activities, the revenues that you are generating in our country. And of course, you want to be ahead of that so you can plan for it. So I'm going to look at my list here sort of upside down. I'm going to say that if you are hiring your first person in a foreign country and you're not empowering them to sign any contracts, you're not giving them a super senior sales, VP of sales for EMEA or APAC kind of title, but they're really sort of a business development. Go and test the market, go and find some potential customers, introduce them to the company in the United States. I think that it's certainly worth exploring the option of the rep office, not available everywhere, but most countries have this concept, or what I might term a payroll registration, because indeed in some countries it's not even a rep office, it's a simple registration of the US company for payroll purposes. And so the key here is that the nature of the activities that they're carrying out would not be viewed as being those that would give rise to tax nexus or permanent establishment. So simply meeting potential customers and introducing them to the parent company, with the parent company concluding the deals, and really sort of dancing between the raindrops, if you like, of the tax legislation, but knowingly so. And on that basis, setting up a rep office or a payroll registration can be done very quickly, very inexpensively. Next up would be the branch. Roger said, if you do nothing at all, you just put your name on a door, effectively the tax authority is going to say, well, the foreign company is on the hook now for all trading and employment liability. And indeed, that would be the case with the rep office too, but you would be very careful that when you complete that registration, you also use employment documentation that supports the job title, the description of the role, such that in the event that the tax authorities take a look at what's going on in order to try to tax anything that's happened, they can at least then see documentation that says, the activities of this individual and therefore of the business are consistent with the allowable activities of non-taxable business in our country. So again, country by country basis, but generally speaking, worth exploring. And of course, then you've got the subsidiary, which is what we might describe as the belt and braces, and certainly the easiest way to ensure that you're shielding parent company from overseas trading and employment liabilities, and also giving you the opportunity to structure things sort of efficiently. And what we typically see, certainly with growth stage startups with NOLs, where they are hiring perhaps a team of developers to work on core technology, or they are going to hire a sales team in Europe under a VP of sales, perhaps based in the UK or Germany, who's going to build out infrastructure around Europe, that they will set up a subsidiary wholly owned by parent company, and then they basically have the parent company be the sole customer. Everything that the subsidiary does is for the benefit of the parent company. Parent company still signs deals, books all revenue so they can use their NOLs, but the big difference now is that there's an agreement between parent and sub, which says this is the role of the sub. In return for this, we're going to cover your costs. We're going to give you an uplift of X%, sort of cost plus type of agreement, and then you will pay tax in that country where you're registered on the cost plus percentage basis. And now, of course, that cost plus percentage will vary based on the activities, vary based on the country, vary based on treaties, et cetera, et cetera. But it's fair to say that a lot of the sales type of operations going into Europe right now will simply go in with a cost plus 5%. And for the first 1 or 2 years, until such time as perhaps your auditors might require a study to be done, that will work just fine. If you try to go into India and do software development with cost plus 5%, you're probably going to get pulled up very quickly, because Indian tax authorities' view here is going to be, this should really be cost plus 25%, because you're a US company hiring developers to work on core technology that's being sold then globally at a premium, and you're using highly skilled, much less expensive resources. We're looking for a bigger slice of the action. And so actually what really shakes out is this argument between, if you like, tax authorities, comparative transfer pricing, and what you yourself as a company are looking for. When a company says we're in India, we're on cost plus, and we're on cost plus 17%, thereabouts, to me that says we've done some sensible thinking. We haven't gone 5%, red rag to the bull. We haven't gone 25% because we're just too scared to sort of, dance between the raindrops. Somewhere around 15, 16, 70% is probably a sensible option in India. So of course, things vary from country to country, but hopefully that gives you an illustration of some of those initial structuring things to think about when you're looking to go outside of the US. Roger.
Yeah, I do see some questions. If you don't mind, I'd like to
Sure.
gather those questions in the Q&A box, and so we get through our slides, and we'll take them. We'll reserve some time at the end. On that last point, I have to chuckle, because India is an aggressive bunch when it comes to transfer pricing, no doubt about it. And here in the US, a lot of times, especially for smaller companies, and just to make sure everybody understands what Steve is talking about when he says cost plus 5, cost plus 10, here's the scenario. You've got a foreign company and a US company, and they're doing business between each other. The foreign company, in my case, is usually selling products to the US company, or maybe the US company is performing services for the foreign company. In either case, we have to leave a little bit of profit in the US for the tax authorities. They don't, they want their share of tax. So how do we figure out what that is? Well, my rule of thumb is that if it's a services, like sales, if it's sales and marketing rather, we'll do cost plus 5, right? Which means that we take all the costs of that US company and we add 5% on top of that. So there's a little bit of income left in the US company. My rule of thumb is that if it's more than that, if it's like engineering, then we'll do cost plus 10. And the reason I say general rules of thumb is that you're probably overstating the amount of income in the US that is required to be taxed here, but the IRS may leave you alone with those numbers, especially if you get a certain type of study called a transfer price study. So you might be thinking, well, okay, cost plus 5 works here and cost plus 10 works in the US, we'll do that in India. And like Steve says, you get to India and they have a much different view. In fact, there's cases where they say, you know what, we think we should allocate income based on headcount. And since you've got, 100 employees in India for every 10 employees in the US, that means quite a lot of your income should be taxed in India. Some companies, in a very loud, public, splashy way, big companies have said, we're just not doing business in India because the tax system is just too aggressive. So sorry for that diversion, but I had to chuckle when I heard Steve mention that. So let me familiarize you with a term that you're going to hear a lot if you're coming into the US. And this is what people mean when they talk about the flip. It's the flip transaction. What they mean is you're flipping your foreign company into a US company, right? And the way this works in its simplest structure is, here's your foreign company. We have shareholders of the foreign company, the non-US company will say, and we go talk to the VCs and they say, we love your company, we love your idea, we want to invest in you, but we only invest in Delaware corporations. So you're going to have to turn your company into a Delaware corporation. Not only that, that Delaware corporation must own everything, because we don't want to invest in a ghost. We want to invest in a company that owns everything. So what we'd like you to do is to take all of your shares of your non-US company, contribute them to the new Delaware corporation that you just had Royse form, and you'll get in exchange 100% of the shares of the new Delaware company. So when the smoke clears, we have shareholders, formerly a foreign company, now owning 100% of Delaware company, which owns 100% of non-US company. And then we do the financing at the US Inc. level. That's easy peasy as a United States matter. The only little wrinkle in there is if you've got US shareholders of the foreign company. Now we need a little bit of tax analysis, and I've got 3 of them on my desk right now that are exactly like that. So trust me when I tell you that it's counterintuitive and a little bit sneaky what the IRS does there, but we can navigate it if you know what you're doing. So relatively easy as a US matter. A little bit tricky as a non-US matter because some countries will want to tax that transaction. So this is really something you have to really pay attention to the non-US side, but the US side is pretty easy, and we do this deal almost every day. So I mentioned something, I don't know how many of you are really looking for venture capital investment. I could spend an hour talking about this. I'm not going to. I will say that a lot of times companies come into the US, especially in my neighborhood, just because they want to attract VC investment. And like I said, VCs like Delaware corporations, so they have to do this flip. But if you're interested, I'll send the links around. You can go to my YouTube site, and I've got hours and hours and hours of content on preparing for venture capital investment. For now, what you should know is that you really, most of the time, not always, but most of the time, you'll want to be a Delaware corporation to do this. Let me talk more broadly about something that I said earlier. About how you're going to find that the US system is somewhat schizophrenic in a couple of different ways when you start to deal with the laws. And this is one of those areas where, you know, the life of the law is experience, we say. Sometimes it's not logical, it's not rational, it doesn't even seem to make sense as a policy matter. It just is. And where you'll find that is 2 competing concerns. One, the US wants to encourage open competition. We really want the Ubers and the Airbnbs and the Googles and the Teslas of the world to come out of this country. On the other hand, you find these huge regulatory regimes that do their best to stamp out innovation. We really want employees, to be able to build up really great ideas. On the other hand, you find regulations that make it really hard for people to apply their trades. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. So there's a path to navigate through this, and it is sometimes not very logical. I mean, look at the way Uber got started. Their business was essentially illegal at the time they started it, but they kind of did it anyway and asked for permission later, and eventually got the laws changed to accommodate what they're doing without taxi medallions. And by the way, just on Friday, Uber lost a big case here in California about their classification of drivers as employees. I'll talk more in a minute about that. So they're still fighting that in that battle. But you find that sort of risk-taking that has to be done here in the US in our startup system just because of our matrix of laws. The second thing you're going to find extremely confusing and maybe frustrating is the fact that you're not subject to one law in the US, you're subject to federal law and at least 50 different laws, right? So, and it depends a lot of times on whether you're engaged in interstate commerce or intrastate commerce. So you can see this is an area where lawyers are pretty important in this country, probably more important than a lot of other places, but be forewarned, be forearmed. All right, let me just give you a couple of examples. These are just a handful of some of the federal agencies that you may have to deal with and be familiar with if you're going to do business in this country. Don't get too freaked out about this, because I will tell you that for most of my startup companies, except for the Securities and Exchange Commission, which regulates the issuance of securities, the rest of these we generally don't have a lot of problems with, unless you're in a highly regulated industry. For example, FCC, if you're telecommunications, well then of course. The FTC is one to keep in mind. It's just kind of a federal law that prohibits unfair or deceptive practices, but don't engage in unfair, deceptive practices and you're generally all right. Not going to spend a lot of time on that. I do want to just call out one thing. In particular, if you're here in California, or even if you're not, if you're engaged in internet-related activities, there is a whole new set of considerations. One is California's Privacy Act, which is going to require you, if you're gathering personally identifiable information about people on your website, like you've got a little link and sign here to get my content, if you have gated content, things like that, you have to give people a right to be, I guess in Europe they call it the right to be forgotten, but basically a right to opt out. You have to tell them exactly what you're doing with their information, etc. So privacy policies are super important for internet related activities, and also terms of service. So some places people pay less attention to that than they might here. Briefly on accounting, I will just say that you will find that we have a concept here in the US called GAAP, Generally Accepted Accounting Principles. It differs from internationally accepted accounting principles, but more than that, because most of my startups are not too concerned with the fringes. More than that, you're going to find a tax accounting concept and a financial accounting concept, and they're not necessarily the same. Just be aware of it, because what might seem intuitive to you as to when you should recognize income for tax might not be the law. So it's something just keep in mind. I'll let Steve talk more about what that means internationally.
Yeah, thanks, Roger. So I think as you set up overseas, of course, there is that sort of concern about admin, back office, accounting, tax compliance, etc. And I think it's fair to say that on the whole, you should expect to have to maintain some books and records. And I would certainly encourage you, no matter what type of registration, to at least track your activity. I think that goes without saying. But the good news is that the extent to which you are required by law to maintain books and records is going to vary based on the nature of the registration, and also to some extent the country or countries in which you're operating. So if you think back to the payroll registration or the rep office option, the good news there would be that, with the exception, I believe, of China, I know that for a fact, there may be the odd other country out there that still has a requirement, but with the exception of China, there's no requirement to maintain accounting books and records specific to that country where you have simply a rep office or a payroll registration. Obviously, at headquarters level, you're probably going to maintain books and records that incorporate, perhaps in a separate department or country code, the activity or the costs related to that country, but you're certainly not, from a in-country compliance standpoint, going to be required to maintain accounting books and records. Only payroll-related accounting books and only payroll-related and HR files. Excuse me, just 1 second. I just turned up. Here we go. However, with a branch or a subsidiary, your accounting requirements are likely going to be pretty much identical, one and the same. So maintaining full profit and loss balance sheet, etc., etc. The big difference here being that if you set up a branch in a particular country, then when you file the financial statements at the end of the year, many countries actually require disclosure of parent company financials, even a small snapshot of parent company financials. And from country to country, those records, once filed, can be on public record. And therefore, as a privately held company in the United States with no disclosure requirements, all of a sudden you could find by having a foreign branch, you inadvertently now put the sort of core summary data of your US company performance into the hands of customers, competitors, simply by virtue of them doing a search in the foreign company jurisdictions, trade registry or commercial register, etc. So just be aware of that if indeed you go down the branch route in a particular country. But subsidiaries, as you would expect, separate books and records following in-country or IFRS most likely financial reporting standards to be filed typically once a year together with a corporate tax return. Some countries may require an audit. Some countries may require you to actively opt out under perhaps a small business type of arrangement. Australia, certainly you have the ability as a small business to opt out of an audit, but you actually have to proactively do that. And just keep in mind that some countries, Italy, for example, being a good one, you will need to have those financial statements available in country, available for public inspection, for inspection at any given time. I actually was fortunate to live in Italy for 6 years in the 90s, and the finance police, who would be the people who would carry out these inspections, actually have guns and all sorts. And I always have this idea that you could be sitting in your office one day and the Guardia di Finanza might just show up with their guns and require that they inspect your books and records. Probably very extreme. Only in cases of extreme fraud amongst large companies you might see that, but it's just worth keeping that in mind that some countries do require you to have books and records available in country locally for inspection. Roger, if you can just pop to the next slide very quickly. There are some additional reporting requirements that could come into play as well. VAT, GST, sales tax, it's kind of all the same general idea, but different from region to region. You certainly, if you're shipping product even from the US into foreign countries, chances are you may be required to do a VAT return because you yourself, if you're the importer of record, will be paying VAT at point of entry unless you're putting that obligation onto your customer. But if you have a local subsidiary or a branch and you're VAT registered, then certainly VAT returns, GST returns will be required. They can be monthly, bi-monthly, quarterly, sometimes also an accompanying annual return that would need to be done as well. Some countries have the concept of a benefits tax return, so anything that is reimbursed to an employee outside of payroll that is perhaps not taxed through payroll, maybe the reimbursement of, believe it or not, home internet because it's used for business and home, but it's fully reimbursed by a company, by the employer. Some countries will actually require that to be disclosed and taxed at a year-end benefits tax return. In some countries, private health insurance on top of any state insurance also could fall under that. If you're granting stock options to your employees internationally, many countries, in fact, increasingly more countries are bringing in this requirement for not an individual person by person filing, but at least at the company level, a filing at year-end detailing what has been granted, anything that's been exercised, taxes, etc. And of course, perhaps more of a legal issue here, but the sort of annual return. You're probably in the United States familiar with the need to file your return at the state in which you're registered to confirm the directors and registered office address, etc. Obviously, if you have a subsidiary in any country overseas, there's typically the concept of an annual return as well. No numbers, just confirming who the directors and officers are, where the registered office address is, and that there have been no changes during the period of the last 12 months. Roger.
Okay, let me just say a couple of things about employees. I just want to call out a couple of things. So number one, we talked a little bit about avoiding having that rep office by not having any office here at all, just hiring some consultants and contractors. Yes, that is a strategy that you can employ, but you have to be super careful because the law in California right now has changed over the last couple of years. And it's a long, twisted tail saga that I won't bore you with. I will just tell you that it's awfully hard for a service provider or a worker not to be classified as an employee, which brings all of this that's on the list. Well, here's what happens if someone's an employee. it causes all of these things to come into play. Minimum wage, there are wage and hour requirements, meal time, rest time, overtime pay. They're subject to non-discrimination protection, tax withholding, pension rights, unemployment, workers' comp. There's a whole lot of things that come along with being an employee in the US. You can plan on it increasing your costs by about 30%, is what they tell me. Haven't done the math, but that's what I understand, because of the additional taxes and benefits and workers' comp that have to be provided. And I guess worse than that, some of these rules have very, very strong teeth. PAGA means Private Attorney General Act. What that means is that if you get this wrong, an employee can sue the company on behalf of themselves and everybody else similarly situated. I've had more than one client get brought down for getting this wrong. In fact, if you don't believe me, you should go Google a company named HomeJoy. They raised $40 million in venture capital, and they were just a platform that allowed service providers and who did home cleaning to connect with people like me who needed home cleaners. And Private Attorney General Act said, you know what, all of those cleaners are employees of you, the platform. You owe us a lot of money for overtime, meal breaks, et cetera, et cetera. $40 million of venture just disappeared. Company could not raise another round because what VC wants to fund a big lawsuit, and that company died. So this is serious stuff. And I've had more than one client that got this wrong, and that was it. So have to be very careful about this in the US. The reason I'm spending so much time on it is that we may see a federal law that is very similar. We have a new president here as of about a year ago, a little less than that, 6 months ago. And he loves the California system. It's right in his platform. And he would like to see a federal law that is exactly the same as California's. In fact, way more liberal, because California has over 100 exemptions from its employee classification law. The federal law would have none. So be careful, because the law might change. You know, we are about 10 minutes left. I think it'd be really cool, and that's the law, by the way, if you want to take a look at it, if we could maybe take a few questions here, because I want to give people an opportunity. So I am going to stop share. And if you have questions, I guess we don't have a Q&A box, we got a chat box. So let's see what's in the chat box. Somebody had asked about US Virgin Islands. If we would like to become active on the islands, would it still make sense to incorporate in Delaware? So I've never had a company do that, ever, in 40 years of doing this, want to incorporate in the Virgin Islands. The reason why is because, first of all, they're just like any other state. Their system mirrors the US system. Plus, there's a 10% surtax. Think of it as a state tax. So if you're only doing business there, just like any other state, then yeah, that's where to go. But if you're doing business there and a lot of other places, you might as well be a Delaware corporation. The Virgin Islands will treat you as a foreign corporation doing business in the Virgin Islands for tax purposes. But same considerations for states, even though it's a possession. Let's go on to the, you do business, Stephen, in the Virgin Islands? I guess not, huh?
No, we have offices in the Virgin Islands, but I've never seen a US tech company head towards the Virgin Islands, unless it was perhaps for tax planning, in which case that's pre-me.
Yeah, Puerto Rico, a lot.
Yep.
There's a whole new different system.
Roger, did you want me to read the questions to you guys, and then you're not having to search, or are you okay?
No,
Okay.
I'll do it.
Okay.
Because I editorialize. All right. For example, someone wants to know about 34B election. It's actually an 83B election. So, what that means is that it's kind of a long story, but if you have vested stock, not options, but stock that is unvested, and almost every startup does that. And what that means is you earn into your shares through continued service. You get a very bad tax result from doing that unless you make this election with the IRS. The tricky part is that it's highly technical, must be filed within 30 days. If it's not, if it's filed 1 minute late, you're out of luck. And sometimes you have to go back and redo everything. And it's not just if you're foreign, just everybody who gets vested stock in a startup would want to do this. Here's one for you, Steve. If you're using contractors for things like customer service and biz dev, is that still considered with?
Yeah, so I actually replied to Susan directly on that, but for the benefit of everybody, contractors definitely have the ability to create tax nexus issues as well as deemed employment issues. So I think you always want to be a little bit careful, similar to what you just outlined about contractors in the United States, Roger. So always look at, you know, the reality. Are they truly independent? Are they exclusively working for you? Do they have any other customers? Et cetera, because I think contractors definitely bring with them risks anywhere in the world, and increasingly legislation is coming in making it easier to be an employee by default than justifying being a contractor. And then the question about distributors selling and delivering through a distributor, no problem at all. They're an independent third party, and you as non-related parties can engage that third party under whatever terms both parties independently agree. So I would say no problem at all there. Using an independent third-party distributor.
Okay, independent third-party distributor. Where are we? Okay, we have a company that's looking for funding in the U.S. Which is the best option? To wait until we have a funding proposal, then move to a C or first? Yeah, boy, I'll tell you, Letitia, you've really put your finger on a problem. It's a chicken and egg problem. And I've been through this conversation. You sit with the VC and they say, where are you located? And say, well, we're in a foreign country, but we're going to move here when we get funding. And they say, well, how about you move here and then we'll talk about funding. So I have a workaround. I have a hack for that. What we do is we form a Delaware corporation. We make it a subsidiary of the foreign company. When a VC says, do you have a US company? You say, yes, sir, we absolutely do. It's a Delaware C corporation, just like you love. And I say, okay, well, we can talk. And then at close, or once we get close to the close, we do the flip. So you can promise that VC that you're going to have your company, your Delaware corporation at close. Why don't you do it right away? Well, you might not get that US funding. And if you don't want to bring your whole worldwide operation into this oppressive US tax scheme, right? Okay, what's the next question?
I love that answer, by the way, Roger.
Thank you. Thank you. What did I miss one here? Oh, here it is. Can you speak on what US companies should consider if approached by a foreign to open a sub in a different market? Foreign strategic. So it's a US company going outbound. And I don't know what SEA is. COGS makes it less tenable to manufacture here. Oh, okay. I get it. So the costs are cheaper in the foreign market is what you're saying. Steve, that's for you. What should a US company consider if a strategic says, let's do a foreign joint venture or whatever?
I got to tell you, CL, that I honestly don't get involved in joint ventures at all. I've seen a lot of that type of activity happen with companies in China. Often actually usually due to limitations on what foreign companies can do in China. And therefore we tend to step out and not get involved. So I apologize. What I can do, however, is I can take your question to my team. Obviously, we're the 8th largest audit, tax and advisory firm, and I can come back. So let me grab your details from here and I will come back to CL.
Okay. Yeah, I do a lot of joint ventures, but the US side, and my preference, and I don't know if this is a joint venture question, it says a subsidiary. So I think it's all of the stuff that Steve just talked about, if it's just going to be a subsidiary. And yeah, that's exactly why you would, because you get some cost advantage. All right, what is next here? We're looking for finance. We're an ag tech company registered in Delaware. Can you talk about financing in a little detail? Not with the 1 minute I've got left. However, I just sent a link to one of my, first of all, find me on LinkedIn and I will share these slides. And I have quite a bit of information on how to raise money. In fact, I got a presentation, how to prepare for venture financing, part 1 and 2. And then Funding 101. So you can find them on my YouTube channel. Make sure you subscribe and smash that like button. All right, how long does it take to sign the necessary paperwork to make a deal between a startup and a corporation? And what slows down the process of entering into a contract with a corporation? Well, On the US side, very little time. I tell people 2 weeks just because you got to file stuff with the state, you got to send documents, and they got to come back. But theoretically, you could do it in a day in Delaware. It's another reason we love Delaware. You know, you can fax file and PDF file, and you can have it done in a day. But plan on a couple of weeks. If you're in California, plan on 3 weeks because things operate a little bit more slowly here. How about going outbound, Steve? How long does it take to get all this stuff in place?
Very similar to your answer, except that there's a greater time range of timescales. I think it's always worth allowing anywhere in the world, 2 to 3 weeks. But in reality, you may in some countries need to allow 2 to 3 months and even up to 6 months. But arguably, and I hope I'm not upsetting anyone here, if you drew a line across the English Channel or La Manche to include the French here, and you look north of that, I would say, 2 to 3 weeks is perfect for getting things set up. If you look south of that, you're probably looking at 4 to 6 weeks. And then depending on where you're going in the rest of the world, I think the 2 to 3 month timescale isn't unreasonable, but certainly we've seen, we've had companies in India, for example, get set up within 4 weeks, which, I think is fantastic, but that's certainly not the norm. 6 to 8 weeks would be, the norm in India. Australia can be very quick. The challenge in Australia is you need a local representative director. And if you don't have your own person, then you're going to need to, buy the services of a third party and enter into some sort of indemnification agreement as well. So that can take a little bit of time. So it's not the actual process of incorporating, but it's some of the bits around the edges that then require time to pass in order for you to get to the point where you can incorporate. So 1 week to 6 months, I guess, is the time window, varying on country.
Yeah. Okay, well, I see we are at the top of the hour. So I'm going to turn it back to you, Sarah. Before I go, Stephen, you might want to post in the chat how people can get a hold of you. I put my information in the chat. Feel free to reach out. I look forward to meeting all of you.
Thank you. Thank you, Roger, and thank you, Stephen. And I will also reiterate your contact information in the recap with the recording to everybody here. So thank you again for joining. All great insight. Again, please feel free to follow up with them directly or let me know if I can help facilitate anything. And hopefully this was as helpful as we thought it would be. So have a great day, everybody.
Thank you all. Take care. Bye-bye.